Good morning, everybody. Wow, that was kind of good. It must be because you got extra sleep, right? How many people woke up, looked at their clock, and said, I can go back to sleep for another hour, huh? How many of you? All right. I love November. November has so many wonderful things about it. I get to put up my Christmas tree in November, all right? There'll be a point you know it happens because there's this national browning out of electricity, right? I love November because it's Thanksgiving. I love the smell of roasted turkey. I love a thick, rich gravy. I love the smell of a steaming pumpkin pie. And I love just a plain black cup of coffee. I never put the two together. I just don't, right? You don't take your pie and stick it in your coffee and swirl it up, right? You don't do that. And you know what else I love about November is we stop and we thank our veterans for serving, right? I like to pray for our veterans, everyone active and retired. God, I just want to thank you so much for those who have served. God, I want to thank you that they took a risk, sometimes put their life on the line for values of things like freedom, God, that the families are left behind wondering, worrying, caring about them. Lord, may your Spirit provide a sense of protection. May for those who follow Christ, may they find opportunities to witness grace even into some hard moments. For those who are carrying the past with them, may you bring healing. Lord, we just thank you. And we just pray that you provide a protective covering and just a love of your Spirit upon their lives. Amen. Again, thank you for serving. We really appreciate that. Hey, we're in a series called Unpopular Opinion. Right? Now, so unpopular opinion were these statements that Jesus would make that at his day seemed like an opinion. But over time, an unpopular one, we've looked at them as like real important truths. Today, I want to look at one that Matthew states that I think was a statement of the first church that was really unpopular at its time. So Matthew, right, we've been talking about this. He's a guy who was personally trained by Jesus, witnessed a lot of the things that Jesus did, was taught directly by Jesus. And then he assembled it all at some point in his life, decades after Jesus, maybe about 10, 20 years after Jesus died. He assembled this so the church wouldn't forget it. And he incorporated their opinions about Jesus that in their day would have been really unpopular. We're going to look at one. I love what we're going to talk about today because I don't think it's just an opinion. I think there's some foundation to it. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some ancient promises. Right? I'm going to give an apology at some point. We're even going to have a geography lesson. All right? So we're going to do all that. I'm going to do geography. We're going to do some old promises. You're going to hear an apology. That's a packed service. I need to pray because I've only got so much time. All right? All right? So God, I just thank you for this moment. I really want your Spirit to be in this moment. Because I don't believe I'm talking about a religious figure of the past. I believe that I'm talking about a living person, Jesus Christ. So I trust you to be in this moment, to use me to do something that is remarkable, unexpected, even supernatural, because it's a church. And your Spirit lives in the people who gather here, who follow Christ. Of course you can still do miracles. So do one this morning, I pray. In the name of Jesus Christ, whom I love and serve. Amen. All right, so we're going to pick up with Matthew. We're in chapter 12. I've told you, you can download the Bible onto your mobile device. I would encourage you to do that. You can open up to Matthew. You can go to 12, and then you can hit 15. It starts with, aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. Matthew's been giving us a whole bunch of clues. There are sections of his gospel that he just connects together, and he gives us little breadcrumbs to say, hey, this stuff is all connected together. It started all the way back when we were talking about John the Baptist, who's having a crisis of faith, and some people who were around him who didn't realize they were having a crisis of faith, but were really struggling with what God was doing in the world, didn't understand it, didn't know what to do with it. And that bounced off to the next passage where Jesus is there talking about how his approach to God is different and is really good when you're going through a crisis of faith, because he described it as light and easy as an approach to God, which is, wow, that's a big deal. And then led to the next scene where Matthew wanted to contrast and say, just so you understand what I mean, right? This is Jesus' approach to God, which is described as light and easy. And then here's all these other people who are really devoted to God. But their love of God was defined by their knowledge of God, and somehow their knowledge of God lost the love part. So that their rituals that they were devoted to had become the definition of their faith, and they lost compassion for people. And last week when we looked at that passage, it ended by saying, and this is remarkable to me, that they were so devoted to God that they wanted to kill Jesus. We're like, what? But there is a place where you can become so locked to your religious rituals and practices, so prideful about your knowledge and devotion, that you can lose your love. And that's what happened. This is a remarkable story and a warning to all churches, right? And now, what Matthew's right. Okay, so aware of this means Jesus knows this is what they're planning. So Jesus does what you would expect. I'm getting out of here, right? We're getting out of Dodge. Boys, get the stagecoach. We're moving on. And that's what he does. He moves on. Now, Matthew is going to share a remarkable experience. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill, and he warned them not to tell others about him. Here's the thing about Matthew, and I love his gospel. He is so frustrating when he summarizes things. Because I'm going to read from a different gospel. So we talk about this sometimes. The gospels are like 4 witnesses at a crime scene. And when you interview each witness, you know what you get? A different perspective of the scene. So this is one perspective of a moment, because for Matthew, the details weren't important. He's going to get to what's really important. But Mark wants you to know what happened because he thinks these details are important. So we're going to look at the same scene through a different witness to hear how he describes it. This is what Mark writes. So there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark knew the people who were trained by Jesus, though he wasn't trained by Jesus. Okay? Hopefully that was a lot of little details for you, right? So Mark knew someone like, we believe, Peter. Peter was personally trained by Jesus. Mark learned from Peter and other disciples, and he wrote his gospel based on what he researched. And at this moment, this is what really happened. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake. A large crowd from Galilee followed. And when they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and regions across the Jordan around Tyre and Sidon. And we're like, huh? To them, they were like, wow. Because it's geography, and sometimes geography matters. And I know that it doesn't matter if you're under 18 on church on a Sunday morning. I respect that. Okay, this is cool. All right, but Galilee is a region of the nation. Tyre and Sidon aren't even part of the nation. They're other cultures that don't share the faith or the practices or their approach to life that the Jewish nation did. These people had to walk, we figure, 30 to 50 miles to find Jesus. All right? So here, Mark is like, people who weren't even Jewish were trying to find Jesus. And they walked 30 to 50 miles to do that. But if you think that's impressive, he says, Jerusalem in Judea, they were coming from all over the nation. That's what that phrase means, because Jerusalem is the capital, Judea is the nation. And they're like, at this point in Jesus' ministries, people were coming from everywhere, even Idumea, which was a nation to the south. They had to travel up to 100 miles on foot. That basically meant they were walking a week just to get to the region where Jesus was. That would be like saying, like, somebody walked from Portland, Maine, down to the Cape to find Jesus. And they didn't know where he was. Jesus wasn't dropping pins. There's no Instagram, yo, Jesus is in town, check it out. Like, Jesus, look this way, right? This wasn't happening. It wasn't like Matthew's like, looking for Jesus. Today, he's here, boom, pin. But only till 5 p.m., show up soon, They had to go and find him. And this is what happened. Jesus created chaos. We like order. Jesus created chaos. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. You know these things like, guys, so many people start showing up. Jesus backing up, shoreline, water. Guys, get a boat. There's so many people crowding forward that he's afraid that they're going to drown him, right? So he's climbing into a boat. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. That's chaos. People who are sick, diseased, handicapped are literally pushing through the crowd in a day and an age where they were so fearful of infection that you were considered a religious outcast and they didn't want you to touch them. They're actually putting their reputation online, breaking social conventions just to get close to Jesus so they can touch them. And when impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You're the Son of God," which is an irony. The way that Mark is describing it is because he's like, and then there were demon-possessed people who are falling on their knees and screaming out that you're the Son of God. You know what that's a description of? Worship. That's how they described worship. And the irony is that for the reason that it's ironic is because Mark was like, there are people who are religiously devoted to God trying to kill Jesus, and there were demons falling on their knees calling him the Son of God. How ironic is that? So now you got the sick pushing through, the diseased. People are like, gross, you're infected. What are you doing? You're unclean. And people are screaming on their knees and crying out, "You're the Son of God." And Jesus is climbing into a boat because he's being pushed back into the water. This is not church, is it? This is Jesus. And the question becomes, why were they doing this? Because last week I shared a really important verse to Jesus. It appears twice in Matthew's gospel, which means Jesus used it more than twice. And I think it was important to him. It was from their Bible, what we call the Old Testament, in a book called Hosea, after the name of the person who we believe wrote it. "For I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." And what that verse is saying, because sacrifice and burnt offerings, well, look at guys, you worship it, you do at your temple, all those things you think make you right with God, they're really not as important to me as your love and knowledge. Because you can show up, do all the right things, go to church, give money, do whatever, and be really far from God. It's this perfect blend that Jesus had of a knowledge of God with the mercy of God. You know what I really think after 30 years of this journey here at this church and just studying about Jesus, I think Jesus really perfectly brought together the ability to challenge us with his teaching. Because he had a way to really challenge people about their lifestyle. He's got a way to really challenge people about their worldview, about how they saw God and practice. We're going to have some passages in Matthew. You're going to be like, Jesus said that? And he also had a way of compassion that made people walk 100 miles to find him in the hope that he could help. And what Jesus teaches us is that mercy can be messy. Truth can be challenging, but it's possible to bring both together. That's what I really think. And I think that's going to be a challenge you see for a church. So now we'll go back to Matthew, right? Matthew has just summarized this little scene. It's like, Matthew, seriously, you have to have some really good drama here. And because for Matthew, what was really important, ever watch a movie and the camera kind of pans back and you get a voiceover and you know that the director is trying to say something important to you about the movie. It's a crucial point in the movie. So in Matthew's gospel, he is stopping for a moment in the midst of this action. He's going to read a passage, he's going to quote a passage from his Bible, our Old Testament, right? About Jesus. Because he's trying to tell us we discovered something about Jesus that was embedded in our Bible. In this book called Isaiah, it was named after the guy who was a prophet, right? In this book called Isaiah, there was these 4 passages that described a servant leader that God was sending into the world. And they kind of had glimpses like, well, maybe it's him, maybe it's them, maybe it's them, maybe it's them. But really, these 4 passages all connected. Some of them called the suffering servant, some are called the servant leader. They were really about Jesus. And that's what Matthew and the first church discovered. They were like, those promises were about Jesus. This is amazing. And so he's going to read one because he wants us to understand this is the ministry of Jesus. This is who he is and what he came to do. Because that set the agenda for the first church, and that sets the agenda for every church, right? So this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. And I'm going to unpackage this for you. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one whom I delight. Matthew actually refers to this all the way back at the baptism in the beginning of Jesus' career. And he repeats it here. And I think he does that because he wants to say from the beginning to this moment, when this whole huge mess, all this chaos that Jesus was creating, all the remarkable and controversial things that he was saying, the way that he treated people, all of that, God's plan. Because God was delighted in him from the beginning. Though I'm going to read this passage the way that Matthew wrote it, and towards the end of this message, you can see that Matthew edited it a little bit in retrospect after having experienced Jesus. But when Matthew writes it, he writes, whom I uphold, the one whom I love. I love that. You know what Matthew's trying to say? God loved Jesus. And God's love lived in Jesus in a way that was unique. In a way that made people walk 100 miles to find him. It made the challenging teaching acceptable because God's love was in Jesus in a way that was just profound, unique, and unusual. And then he goes on to say, and I'll put my spirit on him. That spirit is a spirit of power. So here's the remarkable thing that Matthew's trying to say, and he's put it in context of people being healed and demons screaming out of people and miracles happening. He's like, Jesus Christ was the perfect blend of God's love and God's power, which is amazing. Because if you love somebody, but you can't help them, I mean, that's like being a grandparent watching your grandchild suffer and you just can't make the situation any better. You feel helpless, right? But he's trying to say, like, Jesus wasn't helpless. Jesus was powerful. He was able to do something about the situation. And what he was able to do was really good because he wasn't like a high-powered CEO who just didn't care about his employees. He was the perfect blend of power and love. And he goes on to write, he goes, and he will bring justice to the nations. Because Jesus Christ cares about evil, injustice, suffering, and oppression, global and individual. It was the work of Jesus Christ to enter into the world to tackle evil. He wasn't just showing up to try to do some good things. You're going to talk about this in a minute. He came to rip out the foundation of evil, the foundation of injustice, and the foundation of suffering and oppression on a global scale. I'll talk about how it's going to happen in a moment, but that was his purpose in coming into the world. But listen, Matthew's saying he didn't do it in a way that anyone else was doing it. He will not shout out or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. He means this literally. He goes, you know what was happening in the world at Jesus' time? There were revolutionaries, there were people revolting, and there were angry demonstrations in the streets. They were angry at the government, they were angry at the military, they were angry feeling like they were being unjustly treated. There was racial tension, there was poverty, social unrest, and people were just trying to hurt somebody to get right in. Matthew's like, Jesus didn't do that. There was no crying out, no raising a voice in the streets. Beautiful image now I'm going to unpack for you. A bruised reed he would not break. A smoldering wick he would not snuff out. That's from their world. And, you know, if you drive on 185 and you head, I'm directionally impaired. So towards Southborough, there's these tall reeds, like will-o-wisps, right? If you're down in the Cape, you see them in the marshes. They're very gentle. If you walk through them and you're not careful, you can easily break them. And if they're already bruised, breaking them is simple. A smoldering wick, they had these little lamps and they had these wicks that were in oil, and when the wick got low, it would start to smoke up and you would just take it out and throw it away. And Matthew's trying to say there were people in our world that were like bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. They were broken. They were hurting. They were discouraging. They were discouraged. They were despairing. They were anxious. They were lonely. They were seeking out God. They didn't know what was going on in their world. They were suffering from injustice and oppression and all these other things and poverty and all this. And Jesus didn't want to hurt them. He brought a compassion that was gentle and tender. It was gentle because he wouldn't break a bruised reed. It was tender because he wouldn't throw away a smoldering wick. Every person was valuable. Every suffering was poignant. Each person meant something to him. In faithfulness, he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on the earth. That is a person, that is a leader, that is the God of determination, who loves you so much he will not give up until he can bring about the change in your life that you need. It's a dedication, a faithfulness, and a devotion to you and your need. In his teachings, the islands will put their hope. This is what Jesus brought to the world. Teaching. You know what I think we're learning out of this from the first church is this perfect combination of teaching and love. Because think about that. If you love somebody without Christ's teaching, you can actually just make the situation worse. You can create codependency, right? You can just dump cash on them without changing their lives. You can be afraid to challenge them to grow. But with teaching, you have direction on how to love somebody. But if you have teaching without love, you can be harsh, you can be bitter, you can be cruel, right? I mean, that's what Jesus encountered. People who had the knowledge were really good at teaching and were looking to kill him. It's remarkable, but Jesus had this powerful way of combining these two elements, and he's challenging us even to today. How good are you? Because we tend to lean in one direction or the other, right? We tend to be really good. We know a lot about the Bible. All you people, you know a lot about the Bible, right? You're really sharp about it. All these people are upset because you know more about the Bible than them, right? And you know all about the Bible, and you're really sharp, and you can find it in the page, and you've got your opinions, and how do you express it is just crushing people. No, you guys are really loving, warm and fuzzy, and I want to hang out with you guys, and you just love people, but you're afraid to challenge them. You don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to break the relationship. But right down the middle, there's just some people like, can't we be both? Can we be both? Can we be a people who can say, hey, this is kind of a hard teaching, and yet I so desperately love you, I want to help you. Because Jesus proved that people will walk days to find someone like that. So this is how Matthew wrote it. And his edits mean something. If he were to change the words, it's because now that he has met Jesus, been trained by Jesus, been taught by Jesus, has experienced Jesus, and has written this after the cross and the grave. Because remember, this is later in life. He's not writing this as he's going along. This is years after. He's reflecting back now. And so he's editing this in light of what he has experienced of Jesus and seen develop in the church. And so Matthew writes, he goes, there's three changes, right? One we already talked about. Here's my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love. We already talked about that. He wanted you to understand that the God just delighted in Jesus. There was a love of God that flowed through Jesus that made him unique. I'll put my spirit on him, and he'll proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not stuff out. Sounds the same. Here's the second change. Till he has brought justice through to victory. Matthew knows an empty grave. And what Matthew discovered in Jesus is that if you want to bring justice to this world, if you want to help the suffering, if you want to help the oppressed, if you want to help someone in their anguish, you have got to topple the towers of evil. the substructure of evil that wraps itself around the world, whatever that evil is, whether it's racism or it's despot rulers or it's abuse or it's rampant greed. I mean, whatever it is that's creating this, addictions, all this, what has to happen is you have to destroy evil at its base, and Jesus did that, what Matthew's going to start to describe, through the cross. Through a supernatural power that came through Jesus Christ, that in the cross, through an empty grave, toppled evil. And we're cleaning up the mess. And there's a lot of mess to clean up. What he's trying to say is that if you really want to help people, you cannot tackle injustice outside of the spiritual components. You've got to use the spiritual power that Jesus Christ provides through the cross and through prayer to bring about the change that will transform this world. And Matthew realizes that. It was the victory of the cross that brings about that change. And now here's the thing, because I think what he's trying to communicate to us is, guys, if there's going to be a judgment on justice, here is a judgment day. Now, there's eternal and there's earthly. Eternal justice is God's not bringing judgment on whole people groups. That's not fair. He's judging people by their actions for judgment day, for eternity. But the cross, the compassion and power of God through the cross, provides mercy to anyone who will receive it as a follower of Jesus Christ. You want to have confidence to meet God when you die? Follow Jesus Christ. Also, there is justice for this world. But if you really want to help people and bring justice in this world, you've got to tackle it through spiritual means, because the spiritual means are only found in the church. And when we ignore the spiritual, we're ignoring the most powerful tools we have to bring justice to this world. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the power of the cross, prayer, God's Spirit, that's where we need to start. And then Matthew's got one more change. Instead of in his teachings, the nations, the islands will put their hope, he says, in his name, the nations will put their hope. Because Matthew began to experience that. They started to take the gospel, the teachings of Christ beyond their nation to the world that they knew. And they found other cultures coming to faith in Jesus Christ and following his teachings. And it was not a movement about knowing the right thing. It was a movement of following the right person who combined teaching and compassion. So I'm running a little long because I get excited about Jesus, right? Here's what I think. So I think Matthew is saying something to us. If I were to put it into words for our 21st century, I think that Matthew said this was the ministry of Jesus. This is what the first church became. Here's a manifesto for a church of our day. You know what the church should be? A community of people filled with God's love, empowered by his Spirit, guided by Christ's teaching, committed to addressing injustice, evil, and suffering with a compassion that is marked by gentleness and tenderness for the most fragile of people throughout the whole world. That's the church. That's what we're called to be. And I've seen us on both sides be really good at this and be really bad at it. I've seen us be really good at it. Our church last winter in the midst of COVID, and pandemic, and everyone's like, what are you doing this Christmas? I don't know, being alone. In the midst of that pandemic last Christmas, you remember how dark it was emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically dark in the world, where people were struggling with loneliness and isolation and anxiety and separation during the darkness of winter as Christmas got closer. And we were spurred with an idea, light the night. And so we organized, a team of people got together, and they organized. It was like, hey, let's put up Christmas trees in the parking lot. Let's invite faith groups to grab a hold of a tree, to put a theme on each one of those trees. We had 26 trees. I mean, we had trees that were dedicated to people who were adopting and fostering. We had trees that were talking about the loss of people that were loved. We had trees where the themes were decorated around the fellowship that they had with one another. We had teams of people who come from different nations and were in one faith group, and they decorated their tree to reflect that. It was this beautiful, beautiful display of hope. I remember one of the team members saying, Pastor Dorian was trying to convince him, will you do this? He's like, hey, If this is going to bring hope, I'm in. It's the church. And people came out. And we had a miracle. Do you remember what the miracle was? It snowed, right? And it covered it in such beauty. It was like God said, what a great job. Let me add my decoration to it. Do you know that people came as far away as Rhode Island? And you know what we heard as people walked through? We heard like, I needed this. I'm blessed by it. People wrote devotions, like little spiritual reflections for each one of the trees that just brought tears to my eyes. Because they were committed to bringing compassion to a world that was in need. I've seen us be really bad at this. So there was a phrase floating around during the election last year that just devastated me. And I understand its intention. So I'm going to start with an apology. You know, I've been challenged, and I agree, that I haven't talked a lot about my feelings in regards to when life begins. And I believe that life begins at conception. A human being begins at conception. Be careful now. I'm going to be careful. I just believe that life begins at conception. That's my personal theological belief. And then there was this phrase that popped up because at election time, pro-life, pro-choice, people tend to get into it. And I saw Christians throwing around a phrase, baby killer. I was like, whoa. And I understand what they were trying to say. They were concerned about the protection of life. But I thought to myself, what would a 17-year-old girl who had an abortion think of Christians if she heard that? What would a single mom, afraid and trying to struggle to pay the bills, think if she was considering that? I thought, what about people living in poverty who don't know how to feed another mouth? How would they feel if they heard that phrase? How about grandparents? They were mourning what they didn't have. What would they think about Jesus Christ in the church? Would they want to walk into a building if their perception is they think I'm a baby killer? Is that tender? Is that gentle? Is that compassionate? Broke my heart. And we have some wonderful people in our church. I mean, you know, they're involved in pregnancy centers to try to come around people in loving ways. We have people who are committed to fostering and have adopted. We have faith groups that have thrown baby showers. We have people that just really dove in. And they combine teaching with compassion in a way that I admire. But I thought, what a horrific thing for us to be putting out on social media. Because have you ever heard the phrase collateral damage? What are other people hearing and thinking of Christians? And how have we impacted their reception of Jesus Christ by what we've said? Maybe that's my unpopular opinion. But that bothered me. We can be really good at this. We are called to be a community of people filled with God's love, empowered by His Spirit, guided by Christ's teaching, committed to addressing injustice, evil and suffering with a compassion that is marked by gentleness and tenderness for the most fragile of people throughout the whole world. I think you should take a picture of this, and you should pray this week. You say, God, help us to be this. Here's something else that we need for you. We are now coming out of a pandemic. And you know what? There's a rise of mental illness and social and emotional distress in the United States. People who are lonely, depressed, anxious, fearful, struggling with the isolation and all that the pandemic has put onto their shoulders. Our nation is hurting. Our communities are open to the gospel. And what we need is to be a community of this. And we cannot be a community without you. How are you engaged? How are you engaged with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with your classmates, with your teammates, with your family, with your friends? Are you living like this in your world? How are you engaged here? We cannot be a community without you. The word community means people coming together. How are you serving? You know that we are struggling to fill volunteer positions? Second service, we don't have a full Faith Kids ministry because we don't have enough people. It limits those who will come. It limits the amount of people who come into worship to hear about the gospel because they don't have a place for their kids. Student ministries, faith groups, worship ministry. We need you to be a community with us so that we can live like this at a time when the world desperately needs it, and then we can see Christ do something remarkable. Will you join us? Lord, there are moments I feel like, man, I just said a lot. God, I feel like I took a fire hose to your people. So, Lord, let us breathe for a moment. And will you saturate us with your Holy Spirit? Help us to remember the things, Lord, that are worth remembering. And anything that I said, Lord, that was inaccurate or not worth remembering, let it just disappear. Soak our souls with your truth and teaching. Fill us with your love and power. Make us a community like this, so that in this darkened world filled with emotional distress and mental anguish, we might bring love, compassion, in a gentle and tender and powerful way, combined with truth, to help people discover Jesus Christ.